police, hopefully. Thank you all for joining our second webinar in our Back to the Future, Back to the Bay Future series. We're excited to be diving into the next time frame. So if you joined us last week, we started off with Karen Bisland and Peter Marks giving us, as Peter likes to call us, the way back machine, getting in the DeLorean and going back to the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, and they got us all the way up into 2009. And so today we are joined by Jeff Corbin and Hilary Falk, who are going to take us a little bit farther into recent history, 2009 and 2014, to talk a little bit more about the history of the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort there. So just quick introduction. I'm sure they'll tell you all a little bit more about themselves. Jeff Corbin has worked in a lot of different ways around the Bay, but worked in Virginia, deputy director and senior scientist, and then moved into EPA and was a senior advisor to EPA Region 3 administrator, and eventually became the Chesapeake Bay and Anacostia senior advisor, also known as Bayzar. I had the pleasure of working with Jeff closely when I was working at the Bay Program as a staffer. It was a really interesting time, 2009 to 2014 for the Bay. So I'm excited for you guys to hear more about that from Jeff. And then Hilary Falk, a face a lot of folks probably know well. Also been around the Bay pretty much whole career here, starting off at Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and then moving over to the National Wildlife Federation, where she was the founder, one of the founders of the Choose Clean Water Coalition. Very exciting to hear more about Hilary's experience doing that, obviously. Then moved into the National Wildlife Federation, eventually became a chief program officer, and now has returned to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation as their fearless leader. So two people that had very key roles during 2009 to 2014 in the Bay for a variety of reasons. So just excited to hear more from them. I believe we decided for Q&A, we were going to have folks put them in and answer at the end, or were you guys interested? I think that's what we were going to do, right? Go through a brief presentation and then have some sort of dialogue. Okay, great. Just want to make sure. All right. Well, with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
So, Drew, you're going to advance my slides, right? Can you do it from where you're at? I couldn't hear a response from Drew. Can you all hear him?
I can't. Jeff, can you try to share your screen and see?
Sure. I think what he's got up here is his slides. So somebody's sharing them from here.
Oh, so he might be doing it then.
Okay.
Yeah, he's doing it. He's doing it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just say next slide, and hopefully that works. Well, good morning, everybody. Actually, if you can back up one, Drew. Sorry, that was just a practice. Next slide. So this is really cool, man. Thank you so much for bringing me back into this discussion. I have been interacting with the Choose Clean Water Coalition for many times over many years in several different positions that I've had. It's been an absolute honor to work, not only with the leadership organization, but with so many of y'all on the ground doing great things that you do. So thank you for the work you do, and thank you for letting me be part of this. This was hard putting this together for me. A lot has happened since 2009. We've tried a lot of different things, a lot of history there, and I've realized that I've forgotten more than I remember with my age. So it was also really fun because I went back and actually found this giant Ziploc bag of thumb drives that I had, and one of them goes all the way back to like 2008 with presentations that I'd given in my EPA and in my state roles. So it was hard and it was fun. But this was my slide. I mean, credit goes to Gene Wilder here. That's him. I think this is from Young Frankenstein, if I recall correctly. But I've said this before. This is a terrifyingly exciting time to be involved in Chesapeake Bay restoration because we've tried a lot, folks. We've worked hard. We've thrown a lot at this, but we haven't gotten to where we need to be. So, all eyes are quite honestly on us now to see what we're going to do next. And I think you're going to hear some about that probably more next week than you will today. So a lot of pressure on us. And I've said this before over many years, if we can't restore the Chesapeake, if we can't restore one of the most iconic estuaries on the planet, and it sits in the backyard of Washington, D.C., then I'm not certain we can do it anywhere. So, take that as a little pressure boost. But we can do this, I can tell you that. But a lot of eyes are on us, folks. So next slide. And then we've got this, this is my own philosophy, that there's this, the closer you get to something, the closer you get to reaching your goal, the harder it gets. Those last actions you need to take they become more difficult. They become more controversial. They become more costly. And to get around those obstacles, you have to do more kind of out of the box thinking. And then we've got these, the down, up the down escalator thing. Now we've got climate change. Well, actually, we've had climate change. I had essays in grad school on CO2 in the atmosphere. We've known about climate change, but now we've got the political will to tackle climate change. And that's going to be a big challenge in the Chesapeake. Great Bay Journal article a couple of weeks ago about what climate change might mean for nutrients and sediment going into the bay. We've got species boundary shifts. For example, I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago about eelgrass, one of the most critical vegetation habitats we have in the bay. And if the average summer temperature in the bay goes up by another degree Celsius, we might lose eelgrass. The Conowingo Dam, a lot of you have probably heard about, sits 10 miles up from where the Susquehanna joins the bay. It used to trap sediments and nutrients for almost 100 years. Now it's essentially full. So we've got to offset those additional pounds of nutrients and sediments coming in. pH and acidification, huge progress we've made on oyster restoration. And I would argue that we might be on the cusp of, if we can go big enough, to actually restoring to a fairly significant level oysters in the bay. But if the water temperature increases and pH keeps dropping, we might not be able to sustain oysters. So none of this is a Debbie Downer, folks. This is just reality. These are just to let you know the challenges that we face and the things that we need to take on as we kind of close that gap to finally get the job done. So next slide, Drew. So we've had this evolution of bay restoration. And as Kristen said, Karen Bislin, Peter Marks did a phenomenal job last week, kind of going back to the early days, because they're old and they remember all that stuff. In 1983, the first agreement, then 87, another agreement, 2000, the new millennia, another big agreement. So we're going to talk a little bit today about kind of 2009, 2010 going forward. Lots of stuff happened in that period. 2014, there was a new agreement. The reason I've got 2023 on here is, I don't think this has gotten as much recognition as I think it should. But last year, the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, what they call STAC, these are the brainiacs of the brainiacs in the science. They kind of decide the whole scientific direction of the bay restoration. And they issued a report called Comprehensive Evaluation System Response, CESR. It's been called the CESAR report. And in a nutshell, it says, we're not going to meet the 2025 goals, which I think we knew that the practices that we put in place, some of the practices we put in place have not worked as well as we thought they would. And for the reductions that we have achieved, the nutrient reductions have not generated the response in water quality benefit that we were hoping for. And that most of the programs, either because they're not funded at a certain level or because we just can't put enough practices on the ground, a lot of those programs are not going to be the suite of things that gets us to where we need to be. So that was in my opinion, that was a pretty sobering response. So, the question here at the far right is, I don't know, is it time for, AI-driven cyborgs to write the next agreement? Because us humans have not gotten us there. And I'm saying that jokingly, but we need to really think creatively about what we're going to be able to do to close the gap and restore the bay. Next slide. So I refer to kind of this 2009 till now as the era of accountability. And I'm going to go through a couple of these in the next slides. So just really quickly, 2009, President Obama comes in office, issues an executive order on the Chesapeake Bay. At the same time, the Principal Staff Committee, which are the secretaries, this is the tier right below the governors, mayor, EPA administrator, Chesapeake Bay Commission folks. This is the layer just below the top tier. Cabinet secretaries, agency heads, they adopted a 2025 cleanup goal, and they set these 2-year accountable milestones that I'm going to talk more about. In 2010, a federal strategy was issued that came out of the executive order that President Obama issued. Also in 2010, we had this tiny little thing called the TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load. I refer to this personally as the year without Christmas or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa, whatever your religious belief may be. But it was a busy time. It was issued in December 29th. Not a lot of holiday festivities for some of us to get this report out by the end of 2010. But it brought in this whole new era of accountability, this watershed implementation plans, measurable plans, these stoplight charts, if any of y'all have seen them, these green, yellow, red of are we making progress? Federal actions. This was huge. The TMDL set up where if progress was not being made, the federal government was going to take action and get us back on track, which some folks have called consequences or backstops. 6 years of legal challenges. The TMDL was put in place, and for 6 years, this thing made it through the district court, which actually ruled in EPA's favor. It made it through the Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled in EPA's favor, and then it was challenged all the way to the Supreme Court, highest court in the land. The court decided not to issue cert, so they didn't hear arguments. It was over. The TMDL stood, and that was huge to have that legally confirmed through the courts. 2014, a new Chesapeake Bay Agreement, which I'm going to talk more about. 2017, 60% of all practices had to be in place to restore water quality in the bay. 2018 was this enormous technical midpoint assessment. Okay, you know, we're kind of halfway between the start of the TMDL and the executive order to from there to 2025. Where are we? What needs to be made changes? Huge technical assessment. And then 2025, of course, is the deadline. Next slide. And one thing that dawned on me, and I never really thought of this before, but as I'm going through material to kind of get ready for this, I don't think we've missed anything. You know, I think all possible branches of authority that could be used were used. The executive order was issued by the president, executive branch, highest office in the land. The total maximum daily load, this pollution diet, involved the legislative branch because the TMDL was done because the Clean Water Act required it, but also funding to meet these goals comes from legislative branches. It's the congressional and state legislative branches that acquire the funding and appropriate the funding. And then we had the judicial branch, as I said before, about all these lawsuits and these court rulings. So all three branches of the federal government and state governments were integrally involved up till this point. And then in 2014, you get this new Chesapeake Bay Agreement, which is just this enormous partnership of federal, state, local governments, and then all the stakeholders, many of you that are on this webinar right now. So all three branches of government and all these partnerships, I just don't think we have missed anything. There's not some ring out there that if we were only to grab it, we'd be meeting our goals. We've tried pretty hard, and I think we've done pretty well. Next slide. So a couple of these things. It's funny how, you know, time kind of really dims your feelings over the time. But, you know, 2008, this was an enormous time for our country, folks. Whether you voted for this guy or not, it was an enormous time, to use their words, of hope and change. So November of 2008, President Obama is elected. If there was ever going to be a moment for the Bay, if there was ever going to be a chance to really smash the pedal to the floor and make some progress, this was going to be it. Next slide. So, May of 2009, 5 months after the president is inaugurated, there is an executive order issued on the Chesapeake Bay. Now, that's fast. And some of you might be thinking, gee, I wonder if there was some background work being done before the president was elected. Yes, there was. But it did some amazing things. It set up this federal leadership committee of all these federal agencies, 11 or 12 federal agencies, chaired by the EPA administrator. And some of these timeframes in here, folks, are just incredibly short for especially for federal government to move. Within 120 days of the executive order being issued, all the federal agency had to issue these specific reports on what their authorities were and what they could do to help us clean the bay. Within 180 days, there had to be a combined federal strategy. So you do the math here, 120 days, all these individual reports 160 days later of combined federal strategy. That is like time warp speed for the federal government. And then the strategy to actually implement the executive order had to be issued within a year. And there's some key language in here, make full use of authorities, collaborate with the states, target resources. I mean, you can read the list. It's pretty significant what this was suggesting. And in addition to actions, keep in mind the federal government owns almost 6% of all the land in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So this was, it's hard to overstate the importance and the significance of this executive order. Next slide. So the order was one thing, but the strategy is where the actions come from, right? And if you look at the date, the previous slide, May 12th of 2009, the executive order was issued. May 12th of 2010, exactly 1 year to the date. So we met the president's commitment 1 year to the date. The strategy to implement the executive order was issued. And this picture up on the left, I apologize for throwing in personal stuff here, but this is, I love using this. This is from one of my favorite movies of all times. If you've never seen it, do yourself a favor. It's called Remember the Titans, about T.C. Williams High School, Alexandria, Virginia, 1971, the height of desegregation, forced busing, and forced integration. And it's about a football team. It's actually a true story. And it's about a football team. And this is kind of a key moment from the movie where Denzel Washington, of all people, amazing, was the coach. And this was in the middle of summer in Virginia, hot as heck. And he's making the team do 3-a-day workouts until they start acting like a team, until they start to get to know each other, until they actually lead by example. And this is a key moment where the guy on the right, Gary, the former captain, has words with Julius, the captain for the black side of the team. And Julius says, you know what, this ain't a team, man. You're not looking out for us. This isn't a team. I'm going to get what I can, and I'm going to take what I can. And Gary says, man, that's got to be the worst attitude I've ever heard. And that's where this quote comes from. Well, attitude reflects leadership, Captain. And it's so the team captain realized, he thought he was leading, he thought he was doing the right thing, but he was really looking out for his guys. And it's really a pivotal moment in the movie. And he realized he needs to lead by example. Chesapeake Bay, the executive order and this strategy, to me, was kind of that remember the Titans moment. I mean, this is where the federal government stepped in and said, we're setting the tone. We are committing. We're going to do everything we can to make this happen. We will be held accountable, and we will work with the states, and we will collaborate with the states. So this was an enormous moment. I mean, the federal government had always been there, but never to this spotlighted level and never to this level of commitment. So there's these overarching goals: restore clean water, recover habitat, sustain fish and wildlife, conserve land. A lot of the things you sort of heard before, but now it brought this federal twist to it. But there were also these supporting strategies that were popping up for the first time about expanding citizen stewardship, developing environmental markets, figure out ways other than the fun things through public money, respond to climate change, strengthen science. So again, just like the executive order, I mean, this strategy, it's kind of hard to overemphasize the importance of this at the time. Next slide. And then end of the waning days of 2010, along comes this total maximum daily load, TMDL, that you've heard of, the pollution diet. I mean, this was a big moment, folks, and this was water quality only. And sometimes, unfortunately, people think that restoring the Chesapeake Bay is all about just water quality. It's not. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. There are a number of commitments other than water quality, but basically, this was just a giant technical number crunching exercise. It looked at how much nutrients and sediments can go into the tidal waters of the bay throughout the watershed and still meet the water quality standards and goals that were set up. And then it divided up that pie among all the states, and the states sat down and figured out how they're going to meet those goals. So incredible accountability framework that came with this. The states set up these WIPs, watershed implementation plans. There were these milestones, so short-term accountability measures, and then there were these backstops. If something isn't going right, there were going to be backstop measures that were taken. So Progress is measured at a very minute scale. Action is taken if we fall behind. Enormous state collaboration. I think sometimes people think, well, the Clean Water said EPA needs to issue this thing, so EPA issued this thing. It took years to pull this together. And I was right. This is right kind of when I was in the thick of it at EPA. This is when the state sat down and figured out what the pie was going to be and how the pie was going to be divided up. And in addition to that state collaboration, enormous amount of public outreach and education went into this. And there was also a lot of opposition, as I said earlier, about the lawsuits. And I'll give you one personal example here. That during this time, we had about 4 or 5 or maybe 6 people. There's a group of core people from EPA in the region and in the Bay Program that literally traveled the entire watershed to educate people about what this TMDL was about. They met with legislators, they met with MGOs, they had public forums and stakeholder meetings. And one of the ones that I participated in was in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which, if you folks aren't familiar with this, breadbasket farmland of Virginia, very politically conservative, not a huge fan of the public coming in, or the government coming in and telling folks what they need to do. So we had this meeting in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And the day before the meeting, we get a call at EPA from a representative of the U.S. House, Representative Bob Goodlatte. And he calls and says, hey, I see you're coming here. I'd like to speak. And maybe against our better judgment, but I think it was still the right thing to do at the time. We said, well, sir, this isn't, a political event. It's really not for people to get up and speak. We're here to tell you what this is about and get your input. Wasn't happy about that. So we're sitting there 5 minutes before this thing starts at this huge public theater in Harrisonburg. And we're up on the stage getting ready to start. And the back door opens up way in the back. And Representative Bob Goodlatte walks in, walks right up to the stage and says, I'd like to speak. Or I'm going to speak, I think is what he said. So can't shut the guy down, right? So he speaks, fires up the crowd, walks off the stage, and we pretty much throw our speaking points out and try to calm these people down. And it ended up actually being a pretty good meeting, but that's just an example to kind of show you just how contentious this was. But really, the EPA's credit, we didn't need to do all that, but we wanted people to know exactly what this thing was, how important it was, and why we're doing it. So, and it was also one of those moments, if I ever thought a civil servant might not make it out of a public meeting alive, that was the day for me. But it actually ended up being a pretty good meeting. Next slide. So this accountability process had been set up. You start with, you put together your plan. Then you sit down, you figure, can I actually implement this plan? What is my capacity? What are the gaps? How do you fill those gaps? You come up with a schedule and a strategy to fill the gaps. And then the reason I circled this in red, these 2-year milestones, this may seem really kind of in your face simple right now, but back then, setting short-term goals and measuring your progress towards those goals, and then making changes if you don't meet your goals, that was kind of new to the process. So there was not going to be any more of this set a 10-year goal, make commitments and walk away. There was going to be short-term accountability. And then if you had to, federal actions would be taken. So, and I'll give you a little secret here. These federal actions that everybody was so scared about, there really weren't that many, and there really still aren't that many that the federal government can take to make a state or make a local government do something. I think the only thing we did as far as a backstop, I could be wrong, but I think the only thing we did is in Pennsylvania, we moved around some federal grants out of some programs that weren't working well and into some programs that might get better reductions. And the regional administrator at the time liked to refer to these as, you don't punish a student who's not getting good grades by taking away their school books. So federal actions were really about making changes to help a state or help a locality reach their goals. Because I can't tell a governor what to do. I can't tell a Congress or a state legislator what bills to pass. I can't tell a budget committee how much money to appropriate. So the bag of tools that the federal government had at the time was actually somewhat limited. Next slide. I was young and foolish then. I'm old and foolish now. This is a slide that I use actually to present to the principal staff committee back in the day, just to bring a little levity to the high pressure discussion here. 2-year milestones were so important that even the Bandit and Smoking the Bandit adopted them. So, and probably one of the best movies ever in the world, in my opinion. Next slide. So then the last, kind of leg of the stool here, the new 2014 agreement. It was time to agree again. This may seem kind of small, but think about it. The title has watershed agreement in there. Everything else up until this time was a Chesapeake Bay agreement. So we actually acknowledge that there's this enormous watershed, enormous amount of people that need to be involved in this, and it was going to take a lot of effort to get there. Local government buy-in was key. Again, this is kind of one of those things where now it seems so, apparent, but it really came about in the early 2000s or late 2000s that, even a sewage treatment plant upgrade, agricultural practices, stormwater retention, all that stuff happens at the local level. And if something goes wrong or somebody has a concern, those people don't turn around and call the EPA administrator. They don't call a governor. They call somebody on their board of supervisors or their town council or their soil and water conservation district. So local governments had to be bought into this strategy. And it took a lot of effort to get to consensus on this. 11 high-level goals, 31 measurable outcomes. This is what I said earlier. There's 31 measurable outcomes. The TMDL, this huge TMDL everybody talks about, that was only 2 of the outcomes out of 31 in this entire agreement. So it kind of shows you how comprehensive this thing was. And again, once the agreement came out, sort of like the executive order, strategies had to be in place so that people can see what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. They had to be in place within 1 year. I got to give respect at this point to Nick DePasquale. He was the Chesapeake Bay Program Office Director at the time. He led the team through the entire process to pull this agreement together. Dear friend of mine, dear friend of a lot of ours. Unfortunately, we lost him to cancer not long ago. But his word on this agreement was SMART. SMART. This was Nick's thing. So everything in this agreement had to be S specific, M measurable, A achievable, R relevant, and T time bound. And I remember going through this, man. I mean, there were a lot of things thrown at the wall to see, what these outcomes were going to be. And if they didn't meet the SMART, they didn't make it into the agreement. So kudos to him to really keep things focused and make sure that this agreement was going to achieve measurable results. Next slide. So that's a lot of stuff, and it was really quick. So where does that leave us? 2025 is coming. We're not going to meet the water quality goals. We're not going to meet many of the goals that we have set. That does not mean we haven't made progress, but let's be honest, we're not going to meet the goals. We don't know everything. This is a continued learn as you go sort of exercise, but I think we have to be very honest with the public. Some things we tried did not work as well as we thought they would. That's fine. You don't fail by trying, you fail by not trying. So we tried a lot of things, and I think we need to own that. We need to be honest. Not everything worked. Political commitment today is not where it needs to be. I'm not getting on here to talk about political statements, but come on, the political commitment to Restored Bay is simply not where it was in the past. And we don't have a plan yet. It's in the works, I think, and I think you're going to hear more about this next week, but we don't yet have that plan to say, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it to finish this. But, please, folks, don't take away any of my comments to think that we have not made progress. Enormous progress has been made. The nutrient reductions are way more than I think we ever thought we would have been at this time. Oysters are on the verge of being restored. Land conservation, forest buffers, all these things are huge goals. And to put this in perspective, I live in Virginia. We have an extremely politically conservative governor right now with a very politically conservative team around here. And the budget that was just passed a week ago in Virginia has $400 million in it for Chesapeake Bay restoration. Now, when I was back with state government, if we had 40 million or 50 million in there, that was enough to throw a parade. $400 million under a very politically conservative leadership in Virginia for Chesapeake Bay. And then, support for pay for performance and some other things. It's enormous, the progress that we have made. So my last slide I found this back, actually, I found an old opinion piece that I'd written into the paper long ago. And this is from President Kennedy's, talk to Congress back in 1961, put a man on the moon. He didn't get up before Congress and say, man, we should try really hard to get a man as close as we can to the moon in the next 10 years. He said, we're going to commit to get this done. 9 years later, man walked on the moon. We brought him back home safely. So this is just to kind of put this in perspective, folks. Yes, the Chesapeake Bay restoration is a challenge. We have tackled bigger things as a nation if we have the top level commitment to get it done. And that's what we need today. That's all I've got, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And we're going to roll into Hilary's comments. But there was this one that was really directly from Roy Hoagland, a question for Jeff that I thought we might just do right now, since it was directed at him. What does Jeff mean by restoration and getting the job done in light of the changes he noted that climate change will bring? Does Jeff think that the TMDL reductions will yield the clean water, healthy bay response once we hoped for? There will be dramatic changes in water temperature, living resources, acres of shoreline, etc. from climate change, or is it time to set new goals?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. That's kind of the question of the day. I mean, it's I don't know. I mean, I am not, like I said, that report that came out from STAC. I mean, there are some real brainiacs in the watershed that can figure this out. We've got computer models to run. I don't know. I think we can get pretty darn close to the goals that we have set. I think the bigger question is whether or not 2025 isn't going to be made. Is the new goal 2030? Is the new goal 2035? I mean, I think it's going to take some time to close that gap. And that's going to be a tough discussion to have, because I don't think the patience is there anymore from legislatures, from the public. I think they want this job done. So I don't know if the technical goals change. I think more the time frame is going to change. We have to be realistic about how much time it's going to take to meet them.
Mm-hmm. All right, Hilary, to talk a little bit about what was going on while all this was happening. Was there a coalition being made?
Thanks so much, Kristen. And thank you all for having me today. I also love sharing space with all of you and Jeff Corbin. So this is really fun for me. And I am, in fact, the president and CEO of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, but I'm here as the first director of the Choose Clean Water Coalition. And so I want to go all the way back to 2008, when Verna Harrison and the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network were looking at models across the country on coalitions. And it happened that the National Wildlife Federation had built several coalitions, including Healing Our Waters, a coalition dedicated to the Great Lakes. And Verna had hired Mark Van Putten to look at what might be a good model. And we agreed at the time that it was Healing Our Waters. And so we started to build a coalition, which, as you can see down at the bottom of this slide, didn't have a name at the beginning, just building a coalition of hope for the Chesapeake Bay. And I was a policy analyst at a small think tank in DC, happened to meet Tony Caligiuri at National Wildlife Federation, and the other two co-chairs, original co-chairs of Choose Clean Water, Doug Siglin of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Chris Miller of the Piedmont Environmental Council. And I must have convinced them that I could effectively launch a coalition in 6 weeks, which is what we did, because I got the job. And probably one of my favorite times was back in 2009, and we launched the coalition on Capitol Hill with about 60 organizations. We had just come up with the name. Joy Oaks with National Parks Conservation Association gets credit. We were all in a room brainstorming, what are we going to call this thing? And she's like, well, we just need people to choose clean water. And that was the moment that the coalition's name came about. As Jeff said and showed through all of his slides, it was a really incredibly exciting time where a lot was changing, with leadership from the Obama administration. EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson was taking the helm of the EPA, and just a lot of big things were occurring. The coalition launched with 4 priorities. The first was really trying to support the development of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. but also wanted to work on federal issues like the Surface Transportation Act. We also focused on the Chesapeake Bay Program reauthorization, and finally on climate change, and really making climate change a signature issue for the Chesapeake Bay. We ended up holding our first conference in a very cold week in January in DC, where Lisa Jackson spoke. Many of you who are on might also remember that Elijah Cummings gave one of my very favorite speeches about the importance of clean water. And the coalition really started to coalesce, and all of the work that we had done to lay the groundwork of people coming together. And one of my first initiatives was to write, with help from many people on this webinar, the first comment letter that the coalition developed in support of the total maximum daily load for the Bay. We also generated 14,000 comments that all were in support of the TMDL, while there were a lot of forces working against that. And kudos to the team at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who at the time were making sure legally the TMDL was able to move forward. One of the other kind of big priorities for the coalition early on was federal appropriations. And we saw at the time huge increases in federal appropriations. And I think that there were a lot of things the coalition did early on, but get everybody on the same page on what to ask for. And it really made a huge difference to have all these organizations going to Capitol Hill and asking for the exact same thing. And I think as a result, we saw record numbers in appropriations, along with a lot of that federal leadership, and used the early conferences to really highlight the role that leaders played. And we've got that great picture of Jeff Corbin at the 3rd annual Choose Clean Water Conference. And it was a place for leaders in the Bay to come and share their thoughts. And I think that made an incredible difference. 2012 was the year that Peter Marks came over on a detail from the Environmental Protection Agency and just decided to stay at the coalition. And we were so thrilled to have Peter join. He made such a big difference in our Hill work, and he took me up on the Hill for the first time, and he took a lot of people around the watershed up to Capitol Hill for the first time to make sure that it wasn't scary, and that we were really leaning on constituents from all of those 64,000 square miles. That was really, really incredible. Given that we don't have a ton of time left, I thought I'd just fast forward a little bit to the major themes of this era, and Jeff hit on so many of them, so I don't need to belabor them. But accountability was such a big part of that period of time, and trying to get accountability right, because accountability didn't exist just to exist, but to actually make meaningful progress. And we made a lot of meaningful progress during that time. Probably not enough, and certainly a lot more is needed in the future. But it was pretty remarkable, and there aren't a lot of these kinds of examples around the country or around the world. And the Chesapeake Bay is really unique. And as we think and look to the future, accountability is another major theme. And I think looking at the accountability structures we have and the ones that are working, and possibly new ones that would make or allow us to have more meaningful progress. Collaboration, of course, was a big theme. I've told this story a few times, but I went to the Healing Our Waters conference in the Great Lakes to learn about their conference and their work. And I told them I was here because we were launching a coalition on the Chesapeake Bay, and they laughed. Said Chesapeake Bay people don't like working together. And I'm so glad over many years, 15, that is absolutely not true. And the work that the coalition has done to bring people together to do big things for the Bay has been just extraordinary. And it's been fun to be part of it. And it's really been fun more recently to be watching from afar and cheering on the coalition. As I said, record funding And that is not insignificant in terms of investing in the Chesapeake Bay. And I think, as Jeff said, continuation of record funding. And that's wonderful as we really try to push up that down escalator. And then bringing on new issues. The coalition has been really incredible in tackling fracking, climate change, issues of equity around the Bay. And so those all came around over the last 15 years. And I think has been part of the reason that we've been really successful. So what does this mean for the future? And now in my current role, that's all I talk about with the CBF team and many of the folks on the call today. I think one of the first things I'd start with is we are so much stronger together, and we're going to continue to be effective because we work across organizations with the current administrations of all the different states. And it's not easy, but I think it's so important. The Chesapeake Bay started with the theme of cooperative federalism, which is a fun term you can look up after the webinar. But the idea that federal and state governments work together to solve regional problems is as old as this country and older than that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to continue to think about what that means in the 21st century. I've been talking a lot about not just restoring the Bay, but reimagining and revitalizing the cleanup effort as critical themes for the future, and looking to the next generation of leaders that are going to lead the effort into the future. Many of the leaders who started the Bay movement are no longer actively working on the Bay, although many, I don't know, some of them are still on today's call. But we've got some new leaders, and it's an exciting time again. And when we look at the Caesar report and the new social science coming out, we've got a roadmap, and it's time to make the case again for Chesapeake Bay restoration. So just like 2008 and 9 were really exciting, I'd put 2024 and 2025 and building the next chapter of Chesapeake Bay restoration as a marker. So thanks for having me today. And I know we wanted to leave some time for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So folks, if you have a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A. We had a couple come in. So I'll just go in order, and either Jeff or Hilary, feel free to jump in here. But one suggestion that has been made re the advisory committees, that there should be an added agricultural advisory committee. Do either of you have any thoughts or opinions on a new advisory committee centered on ag?
Well, I guess my comment would be, committee's only as good as the makeup. So I think it would really depend on who is on that committee. If it was truly a committee to figure out how do we get more practices on the ground, how do we fund this, how do we combine practices to get bigger bang for the buck, then yeah, I'm not adverse at all to bringing more voices to the table, as long as the goal is to truly figure out how we close the gap on agriculture reductions.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff, and I think there should be an examination of all of those committees to make sure that those voices are being heard in the leadership of the Chesapeake Bay cleanup effort and executive council. As the Caesar report highlighted, we've still have a mass balance problem in this watershed, and the intensification of agriculture is one of the big challenges. And I think we should look at every possible way we can address that. And I think we're going to need a lot of leadership from the states and agribusiness to make meaningful progress.
And Kristen, if I could just add one thing, I'm always kind of thinking back over my days of kind of what I didn't think worked well enough. And I was involved in many years of actually pulling together the annual executive council meeting, whether it was getting the governor there I worked for or getting the EPA administrator. And I don't think the advisory committees ever really got the voice that they needed to. I mean, they report, you look at the flow chart, they report directly to the executive council. And sometimes they'd be, I mean, there were some meetings where I'm not certain the chairs of the committee spoke at all. So, I mean, if they're truly going to be, I completely agree with Hilary to kind of relook at the makeup, relook at the structure. There's talk about, some new structure to the Bay program. If you're going to have an advisory committee, give them the authority to actually advise.
And then one more question from Jess Blackburn. Noting that the agreement took over 4 years to complete, can you talk about how the jurisdictions made decisions on what outcomes were included in the 2014 agreement?
Wow, yeah, we talked, we fought, and then we got and drank afterwards. It took that long for a reason. I mean, 2014 was the big deal. And again, I give a lot of credit to Nick DePasquale at the time. He kept this thing focused. I mean, this could have been a 100-page agreement with 100 outcomes. I'll be honest, it got knocked down, drag out a lot of times. And Nick would talk to people, and I would talk to people, and other people in leadership positions would talk to people and just try to get them focused. The one thing I don't think I mentioned about the 2014 is, for the first time ever, the headwater state, and things were getting really hard at this time. People could have walked away. But at that agreement, we had New York, Delaware, and West Virginia sign on as full signatories. So I think that tells you that this was focused, this was doable, that this was reachable. So, but it was hard. I mean, a lot of meetings, a lot of people sitting down, a lot of work behind the scenes to get agreement.
All right, anything else you wanted to add to that one? No. So there's a new question in, when it comes to the watershed model and meeting goals, I continue to be curious about several assumptions made about soil health and function, and what the impact might be on doing better in that realm to improve water health. What group is currently owning the model with whom this topic or others similar to this could be further explored?
I don't have a clue.
Yeah.
I mean, part of that is just having been away from this for a while. But here's been my concern. Again, my comment about what's worked, and the models don't tell you what to do, right? Models are a tool. Garbage in, garbage out, or good stuff in, good stuff out. There's the old saying, all models are broken, some are useful. So I think during my time there, I remember the regional administrator at the time wanted to simply park the model. He wanted to stop working on the model so that things would stop changing. And I sort of agreed and sort of didn't agree with that. But I've heard the issue about soil health a lot. I think it's integral. It's got to be built in. I have no idea how at the current time that is being worked in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it's a hot topic, but I would have to do a little bit more digging on who exactly is leading it. So it's an anonymous attendee. So if you want to be anonymous and email me, I can reach out to you and try and get that more information on that for you. Few more minutes. I don't know if any other questions are gonna pop in. And Jeff, I think you just touched on something about Jess's question. I think, right now at this moment in time, we're all sort of thinking what is going to be the next, sort of step. And it's we're kind of in a little bit of a limbo. And so on our next webinar, we'll be talking a little bit more about the current and the future of the restoration effort. If you and Hilary, if you guys had one piece of advice for the people that are working on this Beyond 2025 Steering Committee of the Bay Program and working to try and figure out what the future is, what would that one piece of advice be?
I think Hilary should go first, so then I can just say I agree with her.
Oh my gosh. I mean, Kristen, you and I talk about this probably every day. I think we have a moment to reimagine the Chesapeake Bay cleanup, and that moment isn't going to last forever. And I hope we really take it and lean in to the current leaders of the Executive Council, but also all of the people around the watershed who have a stake in clean water and really think more broadly about what that relationship could look like and what that future bay might look like, because we have made a lot of progress, but as we've discussed, and Jeff mentioned, we're not going back. So I would love for that group to really dig deep and look at the future of the bay in a way that we could all get on board with that big and bright vision for the future.
And I love my strategy because I do agree with everything she just said. But I've thought about this before, and I guess the one thing in my presentation about the political will, the political leadership, that is incredibly downright depressing to me. The last executive council didn't even have the EPA chair, who was the chair of the commission at the time. And I know these are terribly busy people, but you can't keep saying you're committed to get this done if you don't really show the commitment. And I don't know what that is. It's nowhere on the bay and the environment, quite honestly. Maybe climate change, global climate change a little bit, but other than that, it's not on national and federal political agendas for elections. Somehow, if there's going to be another agreement, the 2014 agreement, I don't know if I mentioned it, but on the signatory page, although everybody signed it, there is language in there that notes this is a voluntary agreement. This is not a contract. And I don't know, just somehow that needs to change. It has to be, politicians should no longer be able to say, I'm committed and I'm giving $2 to this fund when we need $10. There has to be a real commitment at the top level to get this done. Like I said, I don't think we've missed anything. If you pulled 1,000 people together and get them in the room, I think we know what we need to do and we know how we need to get there. We just need the leadership to help us.
And then Jess has a great question in here. There's a group in the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee talking about how to center people in the next phase of this work. Do you have any suggestions on how to do this?
I think continuing to look at what are the needs of people as it relates to the environment, and continuing to look at that interplay between people and nature. And I think in there will naturally come out the priorities that would really focus on people and communities. But there's so many opportunities there to think about that and those overlapping goals that have co-benefits for people and nature.
I think the one thing I would add is that I think has been overlooked. It's been mentioned, but it's really not been pushed, is the economics of a restored bay. CBF has put out great reports on this. At EPA, we even did a cost benefit analysis for the total maximum daily load, and it came back like, God, this is really testing my memory, but I think, $6 or $8 out for every dollar you put in. That's huge economic benefit. And if this was a purely capitalistic, economically driven thing, we would have restored the bay 20 years ago. So I just don't know how you make that much bigger of a thing. This is not a thing we got to do. It's an investment in our economy.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we are out of time. I know we could probably sit and talk about this all day. But I just want to thank our panelists again, Jeff and Hilary. Thank you guys so much for all of your work and joining us today to do this. We do have one more webinar in this series. It's going to be on April 2nd. We will be again talking about more recent history and the future of the Bay Restoration effort and what folks are doing now. So if you're interested in learning more about this Beyond 2025 Steering Committee we keep mentioning and talking about, and some of the vision that us as the NGO community have been mulling over about the future of the restoration effort, definitely suggest that you go. And then we are going to cap off this whole series at our conference, which is May 20th through 22nd, right outside of Ellicott City. Drew just dropped the link in the chat to register. I will say we are on track to sell out this conference pretty quickly. We're really surprised at how many registrants we have already. So highly recommend that you register sooner rather than later before we do cap out. But we will be having a conference kickoff the day before, talking about Beyond 2025. We'll be joined by folks from the Beyond 2025 Steering Committee to discuss and have a really good dialogue about the future of the restoration effort. So another opportunity for us to engage in this process. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you, Hilary and Jeff. And if you have any questions or follow-up that we didn't get to today, please feel free to reach out to us. We can always direct you to Jeff and Hilary or try to answer the questions ourselves. But thanks again, and we will hopefully see you on April 2nd.
Thank you.
Thanks. This was fun.
Bye. Bye, everyone.